Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to everyone here at the New York University Institute for Public Knowledge, as well as the participants attending this session online. I hope you can hear and read us loud and clear. This debate is part of the celebratory event that KU Leuven organizes in New York City at the occasion of our university's 600th anniversary. Now, to the participants who already attended the morning sessions of this event, we hope you found the discussions on AI tensions inspiring and insightful. And this afternoon, we aim to build on that strong start with the debate on the topic, Just Cities, what role for social infrastructure? My name is Gert-Jan Put. I am the manager of the KU Leuven Urban Studies Institute, in short, Luce, an interdisciplinary institute that brings together KU Leuven scholars from across our university working in the field of urban studies. We are about 150 scholars, professors, PhD, postdoctoral researchers engaged in city-oriented research, and I will be moderating this debate this afternoon. Now, the main topic of this afternoon's debate, the social infrastructure that is part of the urban fabric of our cities and which role this infrastructure has or could have in making cities more just, very much aligns with several projects which we currently run at our institute. Therefore, it is a unique opportunity for us to co-organize this great event and to bring together our three speakers of this afternoon, each of them experts in the topic, but from, I would say, different vantage points. I will briefly introduce them first. And let us, of course, start with Eric Klinenberg, who is a Helen Gould Shepard professor in the social sciences and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, this very location in which the session takes place. So we should not only thank him for being here with us as a speaker today, but also for agreeing to host this debate at IPK. His research interests and projects focus on cities, climate change, democracy, culture, health, media, and social policy. Eric Klinenberg is also, of course, the author of the book Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. The book argues that the future of cities and democratic societies strongly depends on social infrastructure, which are shared spaces that help us create crucial connections and which promote interactions. But as you could have guessed, we will probably soon get back to this concept in much more detail. Next, we have Luce Beeckmans, who is a research professor at the Department of Architecture at KU Leuven, and who's also the vice director of the KU Leuven Urban Studies Institute. Luce's research is situated at the intersection of migration, city, and architecture. More specifically, she focuses on the housing and homemaking of refugees and migrants, while linking it to broader debates on urban diversity, inclusion, and citizenship. Trained as a civil engineer architect, she developed into an interdisciplinary researcher combining insights and methods from urban theory and design, human geography, post-colonial studies, and critical intersectional and feminist thought. Finally, I can also introduce Jeroen Stevens, who is an architect urbanist and a professor of urbanism at KU Leuven, and also a member of the KU Leuven Urban Studies Institute. Jeroen previously held positions as Fulbright and BAEF Fellow at Columbia University. His research and teaching inquire the intersection of urbanism and social justice in global metropolitan settings. Jeroen's work focuses on housing rights and grassroots struggles and is rooted in collaborations with a wide range of urban actors, including social movements, cultural collectives, governmental institutions. Now, Jeroen is not only active as a publishing scholar, but he has also curated several exhibitions related to his work and research interests, such as the Welcome Home exhibition curated here in New York City, to which we will get back later on during this event. Now that we know a little bit more about speakers, let me elaborate shortly on how we will organize this debate. We will start by asking each of the three speakers to use the main concept of the debate, social infrastructure, as a starting point and explain how they understand social infrastructure and discuss how it is related to matters of social justice and inequalities in cities. And after these interventions, we will go a bit deeper on the subject. And then during the final part of the debate, Jeroen Stevens will then present the exhibition Welcome Home, which is linked to the topic of this debate, but also to the outside the home walking tour that will take place later this afternoon. Okay, I think we are all set, and I think there's no better way to start this debate than to give the floor first to Eric Klinenberg himself to explain to us all how he understands social infrastructure and particularly the role of social infrastructure in making just cities. Eric, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? So first, let me say on behalf of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, welcome to everyone. We're really delighted to be hosting this event and to be in partnership with KU Leuven, which I surely just mispronounced, but I'm doing my best. 600th anniversary is an amazing thing for an American. You know, we're in awe that an institution could last for 600 years. We're praying our democracy survives past November 6th or November 5th this year. So please pray for us also, however secular you might be. But this is a wonderful partnership, and we're glad that you're spending so much of the day at NYU and really delighted to part of the conversation. So let me just say that when I was working on this idea for a book, I had a very specific idea in mind when I used the concept social infrastructure. And it's a concept that came into my work early in the 2000s and that I've been developing for some time, but that I think differently than most scholars and policymakers in Europe. And to make sure that we're not speaking past one another, I think it'd be useful for me to explain a little bit more about what I think about the concept and how I think it figures into this idea of a just city. So I'll begin by saying that when I read scholarship or policy debates in Europe, the phrase social infrastructure often refers to a whole range of institutions, including the higher education, the education sector generally, the healthcare sector generally, parks, recreation. There's a whole set of large institutions that are referred to as social infrastructure. I don't use the term that way at all. So when I say social infrastructure, I'm referring to something much more narrow and specific. What I mean is the physical places, and those can be organizations that have a physical place, but it's a physical place that shapes our capacity to interact with each other. And I think about infrastructure not as a metaphor, and I think in the European language system, like in the framework, the concept is a little more metaphoric. I mean a physical infrastructure that's in the same way that there's a physical infrastructure for transportation. And the thing that you care about is mobility, the movement of people or things. That depends on an infrastructure of, say, roads or train tracks or airports. Or if you care about communications infrastructure, and the idea is that our ability to have phone conversations or go online depends on this kind of physical, there's a physical infrastructure that supports the higher level thing, communications, right? Electrical infrastructure, same idea. In that way, the argument in my work is that our social life, our capacity to interact with one another, especially face-to-face, depends on whether we have made investments in social infrastructure. There's an infrastructure that supports it. Like, yeah, this happens sometimes. We might need to push the door open. Someone's in there. Maybe we can keep it open a little bit. That would be a really bad social infrastructure, right? A locked door. It's like, right? I don't know what we're going to do. We'll figure that out. But the argument in my book, this book Palaces for the People, is that if we invest in social infrastructure, if we design it well, if we build it well, if we maintain it, and if we program it, we can potentially get all kinds of returns to our social and civic life. So think about these elements. There's a design, there's a funding element, there's a design element, there's a maintenance element, which I think is really important and overlooked. You know, how do we maintain infrastructure? And there's a programming element, right? Well, how do we organize the physical thing? We can get all kinds of returns. At the same time, the argument is that if we fail to do those things, if we fail to, really sorry about this. Maybe if we see, maybe Bennett, maybe you could help if you see Mike, you could see if you could wedge something in there, because this isn't going to work. If we fail to do those things, we discourage people. We just don't get fascinated by the door. I know the door is totally fascinating. So the door. I promise what I'm going to say is more interesting than the door. Although door is an interesting thing, right? So if we fail to do that, we make it much more likely that people will kind of hunker down, be on their screens, disengage from the physical life of a city. Now, let me say two things. First of all, it's very important to know that a social infrastructure is not always leading towards justice, right? This is just about building places that shape our capacity to interact with each other. And one could imagine a social infrastructure that's very exclusive, right? It allows for entry for some people and excludes others from it, and might therefore lead to division, polarization, more profound inequality. Like we could clearly, I bet everyone here could think of a social infrastructure that does that. So like the paradigmatic example is what we call in the United States a country club, right? But it could be an expensive restaurant, it could be a private university that says like you can only come in if you have a certain kind of pass, you're not welcome. So I want to be very clear about this. An exclusive social infrastructure that allows a dominant group to build stronger bonds with other members of the dominant group is likely to play a kind of toxic role in an unequal society. Right? One would never say the solution to the civic crisis, the crisis in democracy in America, is to build more country clubs, right? That might be a great thing for the problem of disconnection and loneliness and making sure that you're not just on your bed. It might generate all kinds of good friendships and alliances, but its effect on the social situation more generally is likely to be one of advancing inequality. Is that clear for everyone? I want to be crystal clear about this because there's a kind of facile critique of social infrastructure, which is like, you think that if you build social infrastructure, you're going to create a just society. No one thinks that. That would be a crazy thing to think, okay? It's wrong. On the other hand, there are other kinds of social infrastructures that work quite well as bridging places, where they actually enhance our capacity to engage with people who are different from us, and potentially even to promote ties, relationships, forms of understanding that would be very difficult to achieve if all of our connection was done, say, on Twitter, which is a very bad forum for making alliances with people who disagree with you, right? Most times you disagree with someone on Twitter, you wind up swearing at them, and they swear at you, and then you flame out. Think here of a playground that sits on the border between two different neighborhoods where the residents have a different ethnicity or political orientation or social class. Think about a branch library where kids from different communities come together to read after school or when they're young, or where older people with different backgrounds come together. Think of what we call here a soccer field, right, which you might call a football pitch, where people assemble on the weekend and get together regardless of what they think about each other's politics or preferences. They just like their children, and they like to watch their children play football together, right? Now, the theory that I've developed says that the kinds of social infrastructure that are likely to create better bridges between groups and are likely to bend the arc of history towards justice are places that offer opportunities for regular or recurrent interaction, right? So that people have a chance to engage each other over time. So, for instance, yesterday I was speaking to someone who was talking about a big county fair that their city runs. And once a year on a Saturday, they have an enormous festival and music bands come and there's food vendors and you can buy art and thousands of people come and they mix it up and there's all kinds of exposure to different kinds of people. That's not the kind of social infrastructure, that festival, that's going to do much to change people's lives, I think. Contrast that with a playground where, you know, maybe you have families who are really different, who share that their kids get out of school at the same time every day. And so at 4 p.m., most days of the week, you have these families from different backgrounds who push their kids on the same swing set. And eventually, I say, you know, we look at each other for a while, we kind of nod, you know, the first few weeks, maybe first few days. And then my phone rings and my kid is in the swing. And I say, listen, do you mind? I have to deal with this situation. Would you just keep an eye on my kid in the swing here and I'll be back in 5 minutes? And you say, of course, it's no problem. And I walk 20 feet away and I come back and now we have a conversation.
Okay.
And then,
yeah, sorry.
I'm gonna wrap up. And so the point here is, over time, those kinds of conversations evolve into, we call a play date or a meal together or some shared experience. And I like to ask, and I'll leave you with this question. If you think about the city of New York in the last 50 years, or I don't know Leuven very well, but say Brussels, or I have family in Antwerp. How many relationships do you think exist in Antwerp or Brussels or Leuven or New York because two families met on a playground in the last 50 years? It's 6, 60, is it 6,000, is it 600,000? It's an incalculable number and it's vast. And those are the kinds of places I think we take for granted in our conversations about what makes cities work. And the reason I talk about social infrastructure is because it seems to me we spend a lot of money on infrastructure. And if we could identify social infrastructure as critical and essential for what makes cities work, we could make cities a lot better. Okay, sorry for being so long-winded.
Thanks so much, Eric. I think we already set the scene quite clearly with some rich examples, also even the distinction between the more, let's say, inclusive and exclusive types of infrastructure, to which we will get back. But now I'm also curious, Luce, how you, what's your view on social infrastructure and how it is related to social justice and how you mobilize the infrastructure concept in your work, for instance, on homemaking of refugees and migrants.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so you invited me to tell you something about arrival infrastructures. So arrival infrastructures is actually a term that we use within our Horizon 2020 Reboot project. And this is actually an ethnographic and action research project of 4 years in 9 different sites in Europe. And so within this project, we have this huge ambition, so to say, to shake the way we think about migration. And above all, the way we do migration and we do integration. And I think 2 operations are central to this critical shift. First, our entry point into migration is arrival. And second, doing arrival we conceive as infrastructuring. And this not in a metaphorical sense. I will come back on that. So first, the first point on arrival. So we frame arrival within a broader time-space framework. Arrival starts at the moment of departure, somewhere, but it also does not end at the moment of arrival. Indeed, surprisingly, perhaps we see arrival less as an end point, but more as a point of departure. So in our understanding, arrival is actually a situation, temporary, but sometimes very long-term, of settling that allows one to prepare for the future and for future social mobilities, while also reassembling the past, so for rerouting, so to say. And then my second point will take a little bit longer to explain. So the interactive process of migrants building and transforming the arrival situation, also the physical situation, is what we call infrastructuring. And this is a very broad term which transcends in a double move, I think, what is commonly understood under first hard infrastructures, the roads, the railways, and so forth, but also social infrastructures. Of course, I don't need to say many arrival infrastructures are what we and you, Eric, call social infrastructures. Like you already mentioned, and to which migrants but have to some degree access, depending on their legal status actually. But in our 9 fieldwork sites, we also witnessed a myriad of what we call infrastructuring practices carried out by a wide range of actors who are actively shaping the arrival situation on the ground. Despite these huge debates on integration and these grand narratives of migration as crisis, they are actively doing the integration work through infrastructuring. And so in this project, we venture beyond the rather formalized, institutionalized, and hence also very standardized social infrastructures and engaged with a range of more formal, more or less visible, less tangible, and above all, less normative infrastructuring practices. So instead of this robust physical spaces, which you tend to emphasize, we are talking here about social material practices, mainly of care and support, which determine physical spaces profoundly. And for instance, a good example I find is the private hosting of newcomers by networks of Brussels citizens in their own houses, but also bringing them together in networks. And so a lot of these infrastructuring practices take place in family and diasporic networks and workplaces and so forth. But it's especially this sharing and caring and exchanging and commoning that you also describe that constitute infrastructuring and orients people future lives. And so I just want to say something small on why we then still use the term infrastructure. I think for us, an infrastructural perspective on arrival allows for a critical as well as transformative engagement with the position of the state in the management of migration and integration. States have continuously produced new layers of supportive but also very exclusionary governmental arrival infrastructures. Think about asylum centers and funneling groups into permanent arrival, but also permanent temporariness. But at the same time, migrants and various other actors have also incrementally built up arrival infrastructures with whatever is at hand, actually, including these governmental infrastructures. So I think this notion of arrival infrastructures emphasizes the continuous and manifold infrastructuring practices within, but also against and beyond the infrastructures of the state. And then something very small. So we use infrastructuring here as a verb. That's what you see instead of a noun, to also move away from a very static view on infrastructure as something fixed in physical place. We look, for instance, at transnational, mobile, makeshift infrastructuring practices. And so this also to challenge a bit the stable and entrenched terminology of infrastructure. I think I will leave it here.
Okay, thank you, Luce. Now we've already seen or heard about your view or how you mobilize infrastructure. We've heard about social infrastructure, arrival infrastructure. Now I move to Jeroen. Jeroen, for you, social justice and metropolitan settings, that's central to your scholarly work. In what ways do you engage with this concept of infrastructure?
Yes, this works. Yes. Thank you for that, and thank you also, Luce and Eric, for setting the stage a bit. So I have the advantage that I can now start reacting already slightly a bit during my introduction to your the way in which you use the concept. I guess that within this sort of staging, the picture that I would draw on the particular kind of social infrastructure that is dominant in my work would be a much less rosy picture. It would be much more focusing on the violence inherent to a lot of the infrastructural spaces that we talk about. And on the one hand, in that sense, of course, if I talk about carceral infrastructure, I think prisons and jails are the most obvious spaces that we could think of, and maybe they don't necessarily fit so much in the definition of a social structure as it was explained earlier. But at the same time, I do feel that this carceral paradigm is ever more dominant and present also in the way that a lot of other social infrastructures are being designed and mobilized and deployed and take up very particular functions within our urban metabolisms. And in that sense, I think going from the most extreme on that stretch from prison and jail infrastructure, where nobody will deny, I think, the highly violent and control-oriented, surveillance-oriented underlying logics of these spaces. But where very similar trends are pervading also ever more the design of schools, and you mentioned that also in the book. But even our very public domain and the public spaces we share and in which we cohabit as a diverse society are ever more structured and dominated by what I conceive of as carceral infrastructural design and planning approaches. So it's that sort of shadow side of, yes, places of encounter, places of diversity, places where as a society we can meet and get to know one another. But I do believe that inevitably we can never completely depoliticize the way in which these encounters are staged, because there is always a certain dominant narrative. There is always a certain image that is being projected on how you should encounter, whom should encounter who, in what way should that be facilitated by spaces. So even in the most cherished and celebrated social infrastructure, I would still argue that if you look through a different angle from a different perspective, that there will always also be a violent layer in the way that these spaces are meant to function.
Okay, thank you, Jeroen. So we've set the scene with these three concepts: social infrastructure, arrival infrastructure, and carceral infrastructures. It's clear, I think, to everyone that there's a link between them. However, the latter two seem to challenge in some way the original concept of social infrastructure. Maybe Eric, how do you look at that, at these arrival and carceral infrastructures that Luce and Jeroen mentioned? Did you come across these also during your extensive fieldwork in several US cities?
They don't actually seem like challenges to me. They seem like they're noting different ways that infrastructures can work. So I didn't work on migrant infrastructures. So I didn't see arrival infrastructures. It wasn't part of the research that I did. And I noted, the ways in which one can take a school and make a decision about whether to have a security guard at the front. You probably don't have the same level of screening in the schools that we have in public schools in the United States, because I think you will always have fewer guns, and so there'll be less anxiety about guns in schools. And in the United States, you would be naive if you said, oh, all of the social infrastructures are apolitical and tend towards openness. But I think that's a superficial criticism, because the point is, when we design gathering spaces and we think about how to build a good society, we might have a continuum from, like, on the one hand, what would be the most radically inclusive. Like, take a library that's in the United States, a branch library that says, everyone here is welcome. You have to work very hard to get yourself kicked out. You don't have to be a citizen to get access to the library. It doesn't matter what social class or what ethnicity or race or religion or political preference. The people who work in the library, their job is to say to people who walk in, how can I help you? And they respect your privacy and don't report on your activities. And the range of things that you could do to get yourself excluded from a library is fairly narrow and fairly extreme. I've seen the things, and I think the person who worries the most about the violence of everyday life would probably agree that there's certain things you would kick someone out of a library for, and that those things are okay. So let's take that as one continuum, which is kind of a radical form of inclusivity, with the notion that the state can provide public goods, and the public good of inclusivity and the offering of dignity and respect and good design and all these things for no fee. This is on the side of the more generous, more open. And on the side of the more violent and exclusive would be the prison and the things that come with the prison. In the book, I write a lot about the fact that when I was writing the book, Palaces, the President of the United States, his main infrastructure idea was build a wall. And a wall is a social infrastructure too, but I think of it as an anti-social infrastructure in the way that a prison is a kind of anti-social infrastructure. What a wall does is it says there are people on one side and people on another side. People on this side of the wall belong. People on that side of the wall do not belong. And maybe now in the language that's become common on the right, they are aliens, they are subhuman, right? And this is clearly a kind of social infrastructure, but it's a social infrastructure that divides. So I don't take either of these points as critical. It's just a kind of further explanation that an infrastructure always has everything has a politics. Marriage is a loving relationship with a politics. Would I fundamentally define a marriage as violent? Maybe there's violence in it, but a marriage could be more loving or it could be more violent. So I think the point here is it's so crucial to have a high level of vigilance and criticism, and not to think that we have false and easy solutions to the problems that we create by making things. At the same time, we should be mindful that it's not enough to just be critical. That one of the challenges of life in the 21st century is to think about how do we rebuild, right? How do we rebuild the places we've already made? How do we pro-build in anticipation of the problems to come, right? And as you build, if your approach to building is everything is violent and full of domination, you'll be utterly disabled from making things. So at least make sure you have the capacity to see that there is a continuum. And when you try to design and program and establish policies, my view is have a model that aims towards decency, democracy, inclusivity, and equity, and don't surrender to the idea that darkness is inevitable.
Care to respond, Luce?
Well, I think I tend to agree with your vision, but I think that one of our aims within the Rewood project and in a couple of other projects that I'm running is actually to rethink social infrastructures from the margins. To refer to bell hooks, perhaps you know, some of you know their work. So from the lives of people that are hidden from mainstream society, and also often invisibilized in and by mainstream academic thought and theory, actually. So it's actually our ambition to add new layers of perspective and insights from those who have been historically marginalized and excluded by dominant systems, social and political systems, but also perhaps from mainstream social infrastructures. But another thing is, and what Bell Hooks is saying, and it's so inspirational for us, is that by looking at the margins, that can also offer alternative visions, new possibilities for the future otherwise. And that is also why we are doing it.
Okay, I suggest to move on to some other aspects of the concept of social infrastructure. But we've briefly already touched upon that when Eric was describing his view on social infrastructure. It's sometimes argued that these types of infrastructures can be very exclusive. They can be a driver of inequalities in cities because of the fact that these infrastructures are very often not affordable to everyone. I think about cozy coffee places, other type of commercial outlets, not accessible or simply just not available for all urban communities. Especially in gentrifying neighborhoods and because of the increasing commodification of urban spaces. Well, this infrastructure is not for everyone, and it often only promotes, as Eric already mentioned, same group encounters, you could say, instead of kind of cross-group encounters. So maybe Jeroen, you would care to respond to this particular aspect.
Yeah, and I would also take that as an invitation to maybe clarify one thing that I said earlier. I think exclusion is one thing, yes, and of course you cannot avoid having discussions or critique or debates around then, okay, if you build something, for whom and who do you invite and on what terms and on what sort of agreements and what is the social contract that goes with the use and the aims of being as inclusive as possible, I think, are present in many of the examples that have been discussed so far. Yeah, at the very same time, I can also not stop thinking that most of the examples where we spontaneously think about schools, libraries, you mentioned fraternities, and that they are usually directed at still a quite privileged clientele, that they are usually located in to a certain degree in rather privileged urban boroughs and quarters, or that at least the quality of those spaces will depend highly and be very, very different if we are in downtown Manhattan or if we are somewhere in the outskirts of the Bronx. So that sort of impossibility to distinguish, to not see the fact that these spaces come with certain political agendas and conflicts and tensions, I think is simply something that I would feel has to be openly as part there of the debate. But I think we will we will definitely agree on that. And at the same time, I think then the way in which these spaces are very often built, and also the histories that a lot of these buildings and spaces, the way that they were invented, a lot of them, I think, as 19th century architectural typologies, I think they had a very clear reformist ideology behind them very often. There were certain expectations of in what way these spaces would help in creating a certain type of society, a sort of aspired society, a certain type of citizen that would feel welcome, but that by feeling welcome would also be re-educated, re-socialized into a certain, to fit a specific profile and to fit in better in that sense. And so I cannot stop myself from wondering what is then the social infrastructure that we should perhaps also think about and reflect on and at least imagine that would maybe not completely fit these nice boxes. I wonder what the social infrastructure would be for our homeless citizens, for fentanyl users, for assaulted trans people finding refuge, for asylum seekers and refugees. And that is still very unclear to me.
Can I ask, have you spent time in libraries around Europe to see how they're evolving? Just curious, have you done field work in libraries?
Not field work.
Oh, okay, because I mean, I would say that when I started the project, and started the field work, I had that perspective too. Like, it's the kind of Foucauldian story about the way that you create disciplinary subjects by putting them in institutions that confine and force a certain kind of reform and establish a social order that's, you know, legible and countable and controllable. the library seems like a staid, I don't know if you know this term, like it's a, it looks from the outside like it might be a very traditional conservative institution where our mission is to get you to read a book and to be educated in the values that we are educating for, and you should be quiet when you're in the library, right? Like shh is the most popular word in the library, I thought. And but my mind has been blown by spending time in libraries around the world in the last few years, because I actually think you would be hard pressed to find an institution that has been so dynamic at trying to recognize the ways that people live and socialize now, including to live without housing, including to live with untreated mental illnesses, including to live with substance abuse problems, including to live without after-school programs, including to live with all kinds of problems related to poverty and isolation. And if you spend time in libraries, and for those of you who are visiting, and I hope you'll do this too, I really encourage you to walk east a little bit from this building, maybe on your walking tour, and walk into some libraries in New York and see what's happening, and look to see how people are engaging each other. They've been redesigned so that you have spaces where teenagers play video games after school. You have maker spaces where people can create things. You have play areas where people are rolling around and throwing things around libraries. You have kind of, an infrastructure to provide medical assistance for people having overdoses in library. In the Uda Library in Helsinki, there's an entire infrastructure built into the basement that's made to be friendly to people who don't have homes, so that they can wash and use the bathroom and rebuild themselves. So like, it's fine to take those principled positions. I share them and admire them. But also, like, look in the world, because there are actually things happening in institutions that are really adapting in kind of exciting ways. And so, is it a reformist agenda that's meant to discipline people to be of a certain type? That's not my read on what's happening in these places. And you see it in community organizations and other things as well. So I really share with you the criticism. That is the way the world works. In my book, I write a lot about the fact that swimming pools in New York City are completely unequal. They're available to wealthier communities and not available in poor communities. It's a shame, and it results in deaths of people who are Black and Latino and poor because they don't learn how to swim. And it's a huge social justice issue about cooling also. But in the world, if you go and look, there are some amazing projects, and we should be vigilantly critical of the things that are wrong and the reasons that the world is as unequal as it is. And we should also open our eyes and see the things that people and institutions are doing to try to make a better world. And I would like to see us remind ourselves that those things are happening too, because the risk is that we become so dark and despondent that we fail to see opportunities to make this place better.
Okay, modern public libraries like Odi in Helsinki or the one in Seward Park, those are excellent examples of social infrastructure, not reformist at all. Luce, do you agree?
Well, I'm looking at it from a migration perspective, and libraries, they operate somehow on the basis of membership, I think. And one of the least discussed forms of membership is formal citizenship. And a lot of people are actually excluded from these social infrastructures because they simply lack the papers. Just as an example, take this place where we are sitting now. It seems like a textbook example of a social infrastructure. New York University is opening its doors for the public, the Institute of Public Knowledge. But I had to show my passport to be able to be allowed to enter the building and to access what is going on here. And so in a way, this is reinforcing inequality, because certain groups are excluded from this knowledge that we are exchanging here. And so I think this is really important to acknowledge. But I just want to make one more point on this whole discussion about gentrification too. For me, there is a certain risk, and I think you will agree, Eric and Jeroen, that using social infrastructure, that we use social infrastructure as a form of symptom treatment rather than advocating for structural change. Many of the social infrastructures, such as that you describe in your book, but they're actually filling the gaps left by a receding state. And so I think this introduces a very strong neoliberal element in the discussions that we cannot ignore, that the state's declining capacity to perform this essential work of social infrastructuring. And I think this is very important that we address this if we want to come to more just cities, actually, this role of the state.
Just quickly, just a couple fact things. You do not need papers to get into a public library in the United States. You do not need papers. You're welcome with that. And libraries in the United States teach more English as a second language than any other institution. This is not true. Here, but you must remember that when I initially spoke, I said private universities are exclusive social. Just so you know, New York University is not the City University of New York. New York University is a private school. It is a private, it doesn't have gates around it like other schools, but it is a private university. I would never call NYU an open and accessible democratic institution. Students pay $85,000 a year to come here. Yeah, you think you had a hard time with your passport. They pay $85,000 a year. So it's just not, you're totally right. And let me say, the last point you said is really important, and I just want to emphasize how important that point is. The places like libraries are, which I think do deserve to be invested in and celebrated, and I would not call them neoliberal instruments of civilizing. They're overwhelmed by demand on their time because libraries have become like the place of last resort, because the safety net in the United States is so weak, because the welfare state is so violent and neglectful, because you cannot get decent housing if you're poor, because you cannot get decent healthcare coverage if you're poor, because you cannot get coverage for mental illness and substance abuse, because we don't have after-school programs, because we have so many people who are isolated. This is really important. So everyone falls into the library, or they fall to sleep in the public park. Should we say that the park is an instrument of neoliberalism because it's a safety net for the library is an instrument of neoliberalism, that it allows for inequality? I don't think so. Good. So we agree with that. But let's be honest. Like this place that we're in is massively unequal. Like you've come to a country that is doing incredible violence in other areas every day. I think of social infrastructure not as the solution. It is not the solution. It's just that if you're trying to improve the quality of life for a lot of people and trying to rebuild some kind of a civic and democratic culture in a place that's under threat of turning into a fascist nation, it's hard to know where else you would begin. I wouldn't want to begin without the libraries. And by the way, it's no accident that it's so important to ban books and close down libraries for the far right in this country, right? It's no accident that the school systems have become targets of art. And it's also no accident that when there's a conflict and a country wants to bomb another country and really dispirit its citizens, wherever you are in the world, that they will go for the universities and the parks and the libraries, because that is to hit the soul of a nation.
Just for clarity, of course, social infrastructures or parks are not neoliberal. What I was saying is that we see the abandonment of these parks and social infrastructures by the state. And that is the real problem, the real cause, I think, so that they are not financing them anymore as they did before.
That brings us actually to the point of indeed the role of governmental actors in providing these social infrastructures. You already mentioned the role of the state there. But this is a very top-down way, maybe of looking at social infrastructure. And Eric, in your introduction, you already mentioned that fact that social infrastructure there needs to be investments, it needs to be maintained. So is that the sole responsibility, you would say, of governmental actors, or is it also a bottom-up thing, like citizens and civil society, grassroots organizations shaping these social infrastructures? So that's one part, let's say, of the discussion. So is it both of it? And also, when it's, let's say, a process that involves governmental actors, when there are decision-making processes taking place leading up to, well, what type of social infrastructure should be provisioned in a city or elsewhere, are these in fact sufficiently open to the often very diverging interests of all urban communities? What are your experiences in US cities, for instance? Maybe Eric, you want to take this first, or yeah.
So first of all, there's all kinds of social infrastructures that communities create from below. In the book, I write about community gardens, which I think are a great example of that. You know, there's a lot of places that have abandoned buildings and empty lots, and that have really transformed life on a block by building those. Community organizations are often from below. In the book, I'm really focused on the state and the role of public investment, because my view is if everyone is left to create their own social infrastructure, if we take the state out, you will have country clubs and fancy coffee shops and fancy bars and restaurants for affluent people, and you will have far less accessible and well-resourced social infrastructures that will struggle more to work in poor neighborhoods. So by all means, there's social infrastructure from below. In a way, my concern is in places like the United States, where the state has walked away from the support of these kinds of gathering places, I think it's really promoted inequality. So I think that's just crucial. And there's a lot of different kinds of social infrastructures that are in the private sphere, you know, bars and coffee shops and restaurants, and I just don't treat them all that much in the book, because they're not really matters of democratic regulation and control in the same way. There's some regulatory component to them, of course, but my premise is that the market will create all kinds of inequalities and create better places for affluent people. That's not a controversial claim, and that we should really be organizing around the public realm, where collectively we determine like which neighborhoods get swimming pools and which neighborhoods have accessible parks, and how late is the library going to be open, and what are the policies for dealing with people who come in who don't act according to, you know, whatever standards some police unit has. And I just think that's not a robust enough part of our contemporary conversation. So for me, the point of writing the book was precisely that we live in a carceral state, that we live in a state where neoliberalism has run rampant, and we've produced massive inequalities, which we've dealt with by prosecuting and millions of people in this country and putting them in a criminal justice system. I think for me, the idea of investing in social infrastructure was an alternative to that.
Maybe if I
go ahead.
can very quickly react to that, because on the one hand, of course, I fully agree on the sort of withdrawal of state responsibility in investing and managing and maintaining our collective spaces that should be the foundations of our collective life as a society. Yet at the same time, I would absolutely not underestimate also the enormous capacity of civil society and grassroots organizations, also in, and maybe especially in, the poorest districts of our cities. So it is a bit of a perverse paradox, because at the same time, but what you see is as much as that the state is stepping away from those responsibilities, but the vacancy that is left by that withdrawal is heavily filled by grassroots initiatives, with a lot of incredibly innovative, spontaneous activities and spaces are being formed. And maybe I'm biased by too much work in Latin America, and I'm sure that the US is not completely comparable to the way that this works in Latin America. But I do still feel that a lot of the most sort of spearheading initiatives that are really inspiring and that are offering sort of hints of possible new types of spaces and gathering programs and events and initiatives are much more concentrated in these very informal, very spontaneous, very invisible, very often very hidden initiatives through grassroots and protest movements in all crooks and crannies and corners of our cities, and not necessarily dependent fully on state agency and on sort of top-down implementations of large state projects.
Luce, you want to add something to
Oh
that?
yeah, that's also a little bit of my critique towards institutionalized social infrastructures. Although, you know, don't get me wrong, I think I'm in favor for many more. But, you know, I think it's very, I'm now speaking as a designer. I'm trained as a civil engineer architect. And so I think an important question is actually, who's actually included in the decision-making and in the design process of these social infrastructures and who is not? Because it might be different here, but sometimes if I'm looking at the renders that you see in the streetscapes of social infrastructure and public spaces, you know, that is revealing a lot. It's you know, it's such a homogeneous group of people that is depicted there, if there are people depicted, because architects sometimes tend to forget about people. But it's very often white, vital, young, middle class, but we rarely see people with cars, people in wheelchairs, you know, homeless people, drug users, but they also live in these places. And the fact that they are not there also it means that they were not taken into account in the design process. They were not involved. They were not even in the minds. So I think we urgently really need to democratize the design process, thinking about it as co-production rather than as always thinking about the star architects as the only expert of placemaking. We don't need that actually anymore, because, you know, we end up with designs with a lot of normative assumptions really inscribed in them.
So I have to say, for those of you who are new to the Institute for Public Knowledge, I'm so happy that you brought that up, because the biggest and best project that we've ever done here is a project called Rebuild by Design. And the offices are up on the second floor. You should all walk up to the second floor when you're done and meet the staff and talk about them. And Rebuild by Design was a federal design competition that had billions of dollars of public money to build new infrastructure, 21st century infrastructure for the region that was affected by this hurricane that hit the East Coast in 2012 called Hurricane Sandy. And the whole idea of Rebuild by Design was that we would have a radically participatory design process where we did a 9-month process before architecture teams could even submit proposals, which is usually what starts a design competition. They had to do 9 months of first collaborative research with experts in various fields who did this basically pro bono work. Then stakeholder outreach for 3 months, where we met with thousands of people and hundreds of organizations in dozens of cities and neighborhoods. And then there was a 3-month participatory design process. So 9-month process of collaboration before you could even submit a proposal to the competition. And the whole idea of Rebuild by Design is to establish a model for more inclusive democratic design processes, so that when there is state money available to do something, it's not just Frank Gehry who comes in and tells you that he's solved your problem for it, okay? It's really important to find out what do people who live in the place need? What do they want? What are their possibilities? What are their vulnerabilities, right? What are their, like, really take that seriously and listen to different kinds of people. And we've been doing that around the world, and it's amazing. And sometimes, by the way, you do it and you have a plan at the end, and then the mayor comes in and fucks up everything by saying, okay, like, I'm gonna do what I want anyway. And it's a different kind of violence that creates conflicts. But oftentimes you get much better design ideas. I hope that you'll stay in the United States for a while, because this vision you have about energy and creativity and grassroots, you know, excitement about creating social spaces, it's totally right. There's so much of that in the United States. Like, I think you find that all over the world. Like, people are creative, and we like to organize, and we can solve problems to an extent. Please go to Chicago, where I grew up, and go to the poorest Black neighborhoods in the city and look at the quality of the schools and the libraries and the parks. And if you can, ask a bunch of kids from those neighborhoods to get on a bus with you and drive them to the really affluent suburbs outside of the city, and drive them to the affluent neighborhoods if they've never seen, and have them look at what the schools look like, and what the parks look like, and what the housing looks like, what the playgrounds look like. and ask them if they would like nicer things too. And I guarantee you not one person on the bus is going to say, actually, if you build nicer things from us from the state, we will lose our creativity and our grassroots energy. And so it will be a terrible thing for us. So have them participate in the design of what their playground should look like or what their library should look like. But my God, it's a romantic fantasy to think like we should just let the state do its thing in this country, at least. I don't know where you've been, but the idea that like in the United States, we should maintain this level of unequal distribution of state resources, because otherwise we would be crushing the entrepreneurial and creative spirit of low-income people. I mean, for me, that's a bit of, it's kind of a fantasy. I'm sure that you didn't mean it that way, but I'm making a point, because we shouldn't be romantic about this. And this is like, I'm speaking as someone who knows the American situation much better than I know the situation in Belgium or Latin America, even though I've spent time in both those places. We have a grotesquely unequal distribution of state resources here. If you look at like where public schools and parks and libraries and athletic facilities and housing, and you compare what we do in affluent communities with what we do in poor communities, it is grotesque and indefensible and wrong. And we should be able to say that people should participate in design and figuring out what they want without letting go of the critique of the state that maintains that level of inequality.
I have the feeling that we can keep this conversation going for still a while now, but I am looking at the time, and I just wanted to take an opportunity to maybe open up the floor also to the people here today in the room, also the people following online, if there are any questions at this point to any of our speakers.
Hi, thank you. It was so interesting to hear about that, and it's not an area of research that I'm very familiar with, so it was very yeah, very interesting. I wanted to ask though, so I was thinking about my own life when you were talking, and I was thinking about spaces where I come into contact with people from different groups. And I live in New York. I've lived here for 3 years. I don't have any reason to go to a library very often, and I don't have a child in a playground. But I do go to church, and I do meet people from different communities and different walks of life at church. And I was really interested that religious spaces didn't come up in any of the comments. And I wanted to ask about that, because I think it is a space where people do meet people from different groups. And I think it is an important space, but I don't know if it would be considered a social infrastructure. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
So thank you for that great question. Again, I kind of, in the book, I tend to focus more on the public places for the reasons I mentioned. But that said, the chapter in my book, which is about climate change, actually leads with the story of a church in Houston that was explicitly designed as a multi-ethnic, multiracial church and tried to be very inclusive. It was a church where actually the older parishioners, the older members, were moving out to the suburbs, as in Houston, and they're moving out because there were these new Black and brown people moving in, and they wanted to be exclusive. And there was a push to move the church, but the leaders of the church, they needed kind of unanimity, and somebody insisted that no, the church serves this neighborhood, and the church is staying. And so they made this very principled commitment to diversity and equity, and they really managed to do some extraordinary things. And I write about the recovery effort that they led after a hurricane in Houston. That said, a problem with religious organizations is that they tend towards exclusivity. And for instance, the church, Christian churches in the United States have become more racially segregated over time, unfortunately. And the class segregation is also increasing. So if you can find there are congregations that are not like that, but if you can find a congregation that does all those things, it can be beautiful. But we should recognize that religion can be a source of divisiveness as well. So there's not a clear story there. But I'm glad you found a place that works for you.
I would maybe just very quickly like to add to that also that in my observation, also many of these religious spaces, to me, are also much more interesting in what they do beyond serving as a religious space, and very often have, despite all my critique on many of the religious aspects affiliated to those spaces, so also there I would observe quite some reformist and violence, and but I can apparently not stop myself from seeing that everywhere. But that besides of that spiritual religious agenda, a lot of these spaces also serve as enormously vibrant, diversified communal spaces that where for many people joining these groups or attending, religion is not necessarily the principal reason to be there, but there's all these services and programs and events
And they're also very important arrival infrastructure, perhaps for you, but for many newcomers to cities, exactly because they provide much more than religious services.
So there was another question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the exciting conversation. So my name is Chukwemeka, and yeah, I really appreciate the continuum of interaction, and then you have arrival and then violence. So my question is, how could we, or your thoughts on how the state could be incentivized to actually have more investment on the interaction side and not the violent side? And what drives the prioritization of investment over one over the other? One example that comes to mind, which is related to the project I'm working on now, is my observation here in Manhattan, in New York, is the lack of publicly accessible toilets. And also, it actually also some sort of infrastructure space that you can find across these different forms of infrastructure. So I would like your thoughts on how could the state be incentivized to make investments in this?
So just so you know, my colleague Harvey Malich, a sociologist and urbanist, has a whole line of research that he did about toilets and accessibility of toilets, a book, an edited book. He's written a lot about this specific issue, and I hope you know that research or can find it. How do you get the state to be more, to use its giving arm and not its punishing arm? Social movements. You organize people and you make demands on the state. I don't know that there's much more to say.
Civic participation.
Yes, civic participation is a kind of social movement. Yeah, so you need a culture that allows for people to assemble and organize and speak and make demands. It's nice to have like organized labor that's participating in that. But if you have a system where, money dominates and elites capture the political process, and student protesters are punished and demonized, and dissent is punished. Dissenters are threatened, which is the platform of one of the parties right now, for sure. I think it becomes much more difficult to get the state to make those kinds of investments.
I think what we need to bring in is an urgency. The urgency that we, for instance, have with climate change. But we can combine these things. This is the moment to bring in, to kind of intertwine social and environmental justice within.
I wish we had urgency around climate change in America. I'm very jealous. I'm very jealous of.
Yeah, but we will have to, the hurricanes are following up.
I just wanted to reiterate that I believe the only way to do this is through social mobilizations. I don't expect, and I might be very pessimistic, but I don't expect any social innovation to depart from the state itself. Social innovation departs from struggle. So I believe that only through protest, mobilization, liberation, abolition of the violent structures that exist, and then rebuilding more just and inclusive structures to replace those are the only way to move forward. And this is happening. I mean, this is not utopic imagination of a sort of promised land. These practices are taking place. They are emergent. They are very often very small and very scattered, but there is a lot of agency out there to be observed.
We finally agreed. Did you notice that? We finally agreed on something.
There's also an online question, so I'm going to read it out. Maybe can I briefly, because thank you. So I'm just going to read it out loud. It's from Pleuntje Jellema. Realizing that Eric is sitting across from two architects, design researchers, made me wonder, Eric, from your perspective as social scientist, is it even possible to really plan for and intentionally design social infrastructure as such, or do you identify physical infrastructure that work as social infrastructure? I do understand that investment and maintenance are necessary, but I'm guessing that some places work as such and others don't.
I tried to say what I think you can do to make design more successful for people who are using it, which is to be participatory and inclusive and to really listen to what people want. That said, anyone who's done design knows that sometimes, you get it wrong, and the thing you think you're going to have right backfires or misfires. And so there are some designers who think, you should build things partially, build it 70% of the way and let people come and use it, and then we figure out how to finish it based on those uses. Maybe we should build things like slightly less durably with a shorter life expectancy so that you can reform things and you save some of the budget for that kind of thing. There are all kinds of interesting ideas to try to make designs more successful. I don't think that the fact that a lot of designs have failed means that you shouldn't try to do it better, for instance, with participation. But I think the question has a really good critical spirit to it, which is like, we should be very wary of the promises of planners and designers, because the history of all urban planning and all urban design is that oftentimes people get it wrong.
Okay, brief response by Luce, and then we move forward.
I'm a designer who believes really in the power of quality design, in fostering social cohesion and so forth. But what I also see is that very often design is killing what is already there, and because social infrastructure needs place for informality, uncertainty, contingency, and so forth, and that also reminds me of the book of the anthropologist Philippe de Boek, who is working in the context of Kinshasa, where we see a failing infrastructure, and he really describes how actually people also can work as infrastructure. I mean, suddenly on a street corner, people open a barbershop, a bar, and it's all very makeshift. It's not robust, because you tend to emphasize it very much, this need of robustness, but I don't see it. It's very makeshift, and in the evening it's all gone, but it's so important as social infrastructure. And I'm not so sure if design has a role in there.
Okay, very briefly, Jeroen.
I do want to counter that a little bit, because then if I put on my designer's architect, urban designer hat, yes, I fully agree with that, but at the same time, I completely disagree with that, because I do also believe that some of the most marvelous, most well-functioning, astonishing social infrastructures that we have, they were built as palaces, as actual palaces for the people. And so I think we should also dare to not only take that as a metaphor, as a sort of symbolic place of gathering where collectivity is finding a place and where encounter can happen. Space also matters, and the design of these spaces and the management and the care that goes into these places and has gone historically into some of these places, it really can also play an incredible role. So we can also not just take away that responsibility from planners and designers and say, well, people will act as infrastructures themselves, although they do, yes, absolutely. But let's please also continue to very carefully invest in our thinking and designing of actual palaces for the people.
Totally agree. I'm just saying that they often don't take into account.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and then we can move towards the next and final part of the session, where we link the topic of this debate to the exhibition, Welcome Home, an exhibition, as I said before, curated by Jeroen Stevens, which is open to the public, I think, in June and July here in New York City. Am I correct? I think I am.
Open May until August.
Okay, May until August. So even though it's closed, the exhibition August, we're very happy that we have Jeroen here to elaborate a little bit on this, but we do not only have Jeroen today as the curator of the exhibition, we also have Alex Anderson here, who is the founder and artistic director of Re-Entry Theater of Haarlem. By combining artistic vision, social work expertise, and lived experience as a returning citizen, Alex uses theater as a platform to uplift and support individuals impacted by mass incarceration. Through powerful performances, his work sheds light on the dehumanization of mass incarceration while encouraging healing and social change within the community. Now, together, Jeroen and Alex will tell us more about this exhibition, each from their own perspective. Jeroen as a curator and a researcher, and Alex from his own lived experience. We were planning to show, of course, some of the images of the exhibition, but unfortunately we ran into technical difficulties which we were not able to solve. So apologies for that. It's out of our power, but still, Alex and Jeroen, I think you will be able to tell us a lot more about the exhibition. The floor is yours.
I'll do my best. So it's a bit hard to talk about art without the art being in front of you, but nevertheless, I will do what I can to try to take you through that space mentally. The exhibit was part of a much longer ongoing collaboration with multiple organizations and incredible individuals, all in New York City. It was staged between May and August at a place called Apex Art, which is situated smack in the middle of Tribeca, one of the most expensive and exclusive boroughs of the city of New York. Apex Art is a very specific, very special, small, tiny gallery in between all these huge, some of the most expensive galleries probably in the world. There is a little bastion, a little place of hope that is really trying to function through open, transparent and democratic art selections. So it is a stronghold of activist art, of alternative art, of experimental art. It functions through an open competition, so that basically means that whoever has an ID can submit his or her ID, and whoever wants to have a say in the eventual voting can cast a vote. And the result of that game leads to 5 exhibitions a year. And so together with Alex and 6 other contributing, participating artists and companions, we have pulled a show together titled Welcome Home. We started from a very simple, but for us very fundamental question, where we wonder what kind of a welcome home do you receive when you re-enter into the city, into this society as a returning citizen. We wondered what it means to find home in a city that is dominated by carceral structures and infrastructures, where some 600,000 people are navigating revolving doors between a prison and jail system and homeless shelters. And it's precisely on that revolving door between these different institutions that in fact cater to the very same clientele, is the same people that are being tossed around from homeless shelters into jail, into prison facilities, back into halfway houses, into shelter systems, into out into the streets again, and so forth. So it's that sort of cyclic system that we tried to reflect on. I had the privilege of curating that, but in fact the actual content was produced by 7 artists who all spoke on that topic, on this homecoming process from their own lived experience. So their own art is all related to how they reflect in their work on their own life trajectories and the role that coming home played in their own art and in their own homecoming procedures. And since I cannot show you the 7 works that were included, I think we can take benefit of the presence of Alex. Very quickly as an introduction, Maya, and then Alex, you can much better introduce yourself. Also, Alex was one of the contributing artists, but as the director of the Reentry Theater of Haarlem, he really played also a structural key role in pulling together the entire show. So we were from the very start collaborators also in conceiving and conceptualizing the show. And many of the other artists who were involved actually in one way or another also were parts of the group that Alex works with in the Reentry Theater of Haarlem. With that, I think I will pass the word to you, Alex, and it would be fantastic, I think, if you could explain a little bit what the Reentry Theater of Haarlem is about, what you do with the theater company, and what we did during those months in the Apex Art Gallery.
I'm gonna try to be very short. I was hoping that we had the videos because they will show a lot and then less talking I have to do. My name is Alex Anderson. Like was mentioned, I have lived experience being impacted by the criminal justice system. I was first incarcerated at the age of 12 in juvenile detention, and that went into 3 other. Is it on? Hello? Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I was saying that I got impacted by the criminal justice system, the carceral system, at a very early age, at the age of 12. And that, you know, spiraled and out of control. And I did 3 consecutive sentences, totaling 15 years. The last conviction was for possession of marijuana. And these convictions kept happening in this system. And we mentioned about the infrastructure, and I want to get to that. The infrastructure, and what the infrastructure was impacting my life in a very negative way, right? Because I kept going in and out of prison. And I just want to read this, well, I thought I was going to read it, but I was going to read some stuff about and give a couple of statistics. Jerome just mentioned 600,000 a year are released from prison. And it's estimated that out of those 600,000, a quarter of them will return back to prison within 3 years, right? And I was caught up in that infrastructure. That's what we're talking about, infrastructure. I was caught up into that. That infrastructure was creating this revolving door with my life. And I can tell you, every time I came home, I said, I'm gonna get a job, I'm gonna do the right thing, I'm gonna reintegrate back into society. But it kept happening. The point that I'm trying to make here is that at some point I said to myself, I have to stop this, right? I can't leave it to somebody else. I have to stop this. I was telling Jerome earlier that one of Bob Marley's songs says, emancipate yourself. And so that's where I had to stop. And so a couple of years ago, I decided to get involved in theater, because I heard that the definition of theater is to be seen, right? And to be heard and to be noticed. So I got involved in theater to help stop this revolving door, help create a new infrastructure for me. I wasn't doing this to save 600,000 other individuals. I was doing it for me because I was in a crisis. I was facing another 4th year in prison and approaching the age of 50. And I didn't want to go through that. So I created a space for myself, and I called it theater. And I have no background in theater. My background is in social work. I have a degree in social work, and I do social work to help other individuals. So I called it theater because I said to myself, you need a place to be seen. You need a place to be heard. You need a place to tell people about what you're going through and get the support that you need from a community that you come from. So I created this space called Reentry Theater of Haarlem. The word Haarlem has absolutely nothing to do with where we are located, even though we do perform in Haarlem sometimes. It has everything to do with the Haarlem Renaissance and create. So that's another space that I wanted to create, an artistic and creative space to use the power of art to recreate myself, right? And I found out that it really works that way for me. Maybe I can help other individuals. As a social worker, I wasn't really helping the community that I come from, because those statistics about a quarter of 600,000 go back, it's been the same. Those statistics doesn't really change. Come home and they go right back to prison, right? So I wanted to break that cycle for myself, and then I started to apply it to other people, and we got involved in this community that I'm trying to build called Reentry Theater Harlem. And of course, there is not that kind of resources and funding to build a community, but I heard Eric and other people up here talking about resources and you know, being a part of that, and without the resources, right? But it actually worked better for me not having the resources, because then I didn't have the funding that comes with a lot of restriction. I didn't have none of that, so I was able to produce and create this kind of space, not just for myself, but for other individuals as well, to be seen, to be heard, to be able to tell their stories. And that's what found me, creating these spaces and creating. Yeah, so, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I wanted to create a space, an infrastructure where it didn't lead to prison. I wanted to create an infrastructure that led to empowerment, that led to healing. That's where.
Yeah, you have some time. I have to say that thank you very much, first of all, Alex, for your very well, powerful testimony, I would say. There's also a question, well, more of a comment from the online participants, that it would be wonderful to see the videos or get a link from the speakers at a later stage, if that's possible. But go ahead.
So two things on that. First of all, there is everything is very carefully cataloged and documented on the website of APEXR. So if you go to past shows, there's all the videos and photographs and the text on the exhibit that you can see. There's even a 3D scan of the exhibit hall, so you can literally virtually walk through the exhibit. Second, Alex, I think you're being very humble. Because the Reentry Theater is really one of those iconic, to me, spaces and groups that is really indicative of what I mentioned earlier, as those are the spearheads of building more just cities. The theater company operates, well, they have been operating in different locations. I always have to trace them back. But when I met them, they were operating in a dark basement of a black Mount Zion church in the middle of the center of Haarlem. It's a very informal space, a few tables, a few chairs, but it's right there in that location that weekly, almost daily at certain occasions, gatherings of community members finding each other, trying to help out each other, supporting each other, spreading the message, finding new members, bringing performances together, and eventually making it up to Broadway stages with the performances that they would pull off. It is exactly those spaces of hope that really encourage me and make me believe that, yes, it is within the grassroots realm, it is within that very often largely invisible realm of enormous social engagement and commitment that inclusive infrastructures and social justice is being produced on an everyday basis.
Okay, thank you, Jeroen. Maybe as a last, yeah, thank you. Maybe as a very last point, Jeroen, as you know, the next part of today's event will be a guided city walk. Well, actually 2 guided city walks, among which one will be organized by people from Tenement Museum, which is called Outside the Home. Maybe it's interesting also for the people who will join that walk to where do you see the link between your work here and then this particular walk, or the Tenement Museum. I know you have experiences also with the organization there.
Well, I think that the link to the Tenement Museum and the walk that we will have, at least part of us will have, in a certain way links very closely to a lot of the topics that we have been discussing, because it makes us aware of the very long history that some of these spaces and infrastructures, as we have called them today, have in our cities. And it's that long history of planning and designing certain spaces with all the conflicts and contradictions that this inevitably involves. Some of the so-called social initiatives in the early 19th century, the first almshouses and poorhouses, the first prisons were built with a very social agenda in mind. People at the vanguard of building the first prison systems, they were very convinced that within a few decades, no prison would be present anymore, that it would simply solve the issue of crime. And so they assumed that within a few decades, we would not need these institutions any longer. Reality has unfortunately proven that to be naive in retrospect now, but there have been a lot of good intentions trying to respond to dire social challenges related to housing, related to the slum conditions that were very prominently present in the tenements of downtown New York. And again, always the responses to those challenges have very often proven to be at least equally problematic and troublesome afterwards. But so we have a very long history, and not the least in this city, of dealing with those challenges. And in that sense, I think that walk will for sure be a nice continuation of some of the lines of thought that started to come up during this conversation.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. And well, we've come to the end of the session with that. So I would like to thank a number of people, of course, first of all, the speakers of today, Eric Klinenberg, Luce Beeckmans, Jeroen Stevens. Thank you very much for your insightful interventions during this debate. Alex Anderson, thank you for your powerful testimony and to give us some background on your work at the theater. Michael Konsekwicz, I don't know if he's still here, but he is the Associate Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge. I want to thank him for his support in preparing and hosting this event. And of course, the KU Leuven colleagues who are here, who are co-organizing today's event for supporting us. So we hope you enjoyed the discussions this afternoon, and we hope to see you later today during the networking event and during one of the guided city walks. Thank you very much.